Pennsylvania, May 28, 1754. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington squints through the near-total darkness of a starless night, looking down upon an encampment of 36 French-Canadian soldiers in the glen below, 60 miles east of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Flanked by 40 Virginia troops and a dozen Iroquois warriors, the 21-year-old Washington stands at the precipice of a vicious battle, one that will prove to be a defining point in his life. Pressure has been building to this catalytic event between the French and British Empire for years, as their imperialist desires for North America come to a head. The French, under the rule of King Louis XV, have been expanding ever southward from northeastern Canada, where New France holds substantial territory. From the eastern half of Canada, throughout the Great Lakes region, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Mississippi River. Disputes over these resource-rich lands are nothing new to the French Empire. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century saw clashes over the territory that plagued the Northeast for nearly a century, and its conclusive treaty, the Great Peace of Montreal that brought 39 indigenous nations together to make a peace with New France in 1701, provided but 16 years of ceasefire before violence broke out again. The expansionist desires of New France faced a looming threat in what would become a multi-dimensional conflict for the highly sought-after Ohio country, a region which was comprised of present-day Ohio, Indiana, and parts of western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. This territory was collected under the British Royal Grant to the Ohio Company, entrusted to encourage settlement as well as to offer protection from French aggression and advancement into the region. Among the champions of British colonial expansion was Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, a native of Glasgow, Scotland. While many governors of British colonies remained in Europe, Dinwiddie served as the de facto royal governor of Virginia. His interest in the Ohio country was not purely political, as he was a major stockholder in the Ohio Company. The Ohio Company had conducted surveys and established a few small settlements in the Ohio Territory. In 1753, upon learning of the construction of multiple French fortifications near Lake Erie, Governor Dinwiddie would send an 8-man party to formally request the French withdrawal from the territory. Dinwiddie selected a young major from the Virginia militia to lead this expedition, a 21-year-old George Washington. The Virginian governor was not the only leader in the area who took opposition to the French territorial expansion. A Mingo chief, Tanacherison, also known as the Half-King, also took umbrage with the new fortifications being built in his region. The Half-King had met with the commander of French-Canadian construction efforts, Paul Marin de la Malgue, and Tanacherison had bestowed a belt of wampum to the commander in a goodwill gesture before delivering a message of concern for the French advancements. The French commander had took a direct and incendiary approach to his response, slamming down the wampum to the floor and charging back, "I tell you, before the river I will go. If the river is blocked up, I will have the forces burst it open and tread under my feet all that oppose me. I despise all the stupid things you have said." Understandably, this insulted the Half-King, and he had already had a particular disdain for the way his people had been treated by the French, treating the natives more as offspring than equals. In December of 1753, Major Washington's envoy would head northwest to the Ohio Territory. The directive Washington was given, handed down from Dinwiddie directly from London, is as follows. If the French were found to be building forts on English soil, they should be peacefully asked to depart. If they have failed to comply, however, we do hereby strictly charge and command you to drive them off by force of arms. The order was signed directly by King George II. Washington's selection for this mission at such a young age was in part because of his experience as a land surveyor, which gave him a unique understanding of the terrain that he was about to traverse. Upon their arrival at Logstown, Major Washington requested a conference with Seneca tribal leader Tanacherison. Washington handed the Half-King's associate a string of wampum and some tobacco to his deputy upon delivering the request. On November 25th, the half-king arrived to meet Washington and intimated to the young major many horrid tales of the French, that they had killed, cooked, and then cannibalized his father, that he was told that he and his people were akin to flies and mosquitoes, as mere annoyances to the French. The native leader said that he viewed the British as trading peers, while their French counterparts were coming to conquer and displace them. The half-king adorned George Washington with the nickname Canatacarius, the same nickname that was likewise bestowed upon George's great-grandfather, John Washington. The name means town taker and destroyer of villages, and while it might seem like a bit of a slight against him, Washington was quite happy with the name, and would even write about it later in life, noting that it was not given to him as an insult. Washington's request for the half-king to provide an escort to the French fort to deliver his diplomatic message was granted, after a few days' delay for the natives to ceremonially bestow wampum on their new young ally. The escort that he was offered was composed of only 4 men, including the half-king, and the journey consisted of 5 days of trudging through near-freezing rains, bitter winds, and thick mud from the ground that had not yet solidified under a proper winter's freeze. Washington arrived at the trading post of Venango and was greeted by the French captain Philippe Thomas Chabert de Joncaire, born to a French officer and a Seneca woman. He served as a translator in French and Indian affairs. The wine flowed freely that night, but Washington kept his wits about him and listened keenly as the French began to disclose their ambitious design to take possession of the Ohio, and they revealed the location of their forts in drunken negligence. After a few days' delay at Venango, the young Major Washington's party, now accompanied by both a native as well as a French escort, headed off for Fort Le Boeuf. The 40-mile journey consisted of some of the most difficult conditions he had faced yet, with many mires and swamps needing to be covered. With the temperature plummeting below freezing, Washington rode on ahead of his party with Christopher Gist. Gist was a frontiersman from North Carolina cut from the same cloth as Daniel Boone, a man who Gist would call his neighbor while living on the Pennsylvania frontier. Gist had been hired by the Ohio Company for £150, a meager salary that Washington would have been happy to pay him innumerable times over if he had had the requisite funds. The arduous journey to Fort Le Boeuf would come to a close on the night of December 11th, as Washington and Gist would arrive at the makeshift compound consisting of 4 buildings put together with haste using bark and plank. Was the gray-haired, one-eyed commander who remained hospitable even after learning of Washington's message calling for the withdrawal of French Canadians from the Ohio Valley. Saint-Pierre informed Washington that he did not feel obliged to obey the directive he had been delivered, and stated that the French had every right to kill and capture British traders within the Ohio country. Colonial Britain's concerns about French expansion had now been proven accurate, and Washington took great care while at the fort to compile extensive notes on the hundreds of canoes and the extensive armaments that the French had stockpiled. Before heading back, Washington would come to find that Saint-Pierre had offered liquor, guns, and provisions to the half-king and his men in an attempt to get them to stay at Fort Le Boeuf and forego returning as guides with Washington. Upon learning of this plot, an irate Washington confronted the half-king and accused him of betraying his agreement and confidence. The half-king denied any involvement, but was understandably irritated by the accusation. While Washington had a zealous ambition to return to Williamsburg with news of the belligerent actions of the French and their non-compliant response to his delivered message, the journey home put the young major's life in precarious circumstances on multiple occasions. The horses that had been brought along on the journey were in such poor condition that it was decided better to abandon them. Washington and Gist, with a couple of the natives as guides, headed forth on their own as they endeavored to promptly bring the French response to Governor Dinwiddie. As Gist and Washington navigated their canoe through icy waters, Nearly being upended on multiple occasions and plunging into the frigid current, they arrived at the first rest stop. And when their native guides would not continue on with them, they made the trek on their own. Along the way, they met a party of French Indians who agreed to be their guides, taking them the shortest way to the Ohio River. Washington was suffering from exhaustion so severely, he let one of the guides carry his backpack along the route. After trekking a substantial distance, the French Indian guide suddenly raced out ahead of them and turned around just 10 yards away and fired directly at Washington and Gist. Christopher Gist rushed forward and took the native to the ground, preparing to slay their would-be killer when Washington cried out for him to stop. Washington spared the hostile guide's life, instead opting to bind him until dusk and then release him into the woods. Washington and Gist traveled until dawn in the opposite direction, all the while fearing a reprisal attack. They would then spend an entire day crafting a makeshift raft to cross the Allegheny River. Once they launched the watercraft, they became aware of how swift and violent the current truly was, and when the canoe struck a chunk of ice racing downstream, Washington was thrown into the freezing waters. He fought his way to the surface and latched onto a chunk of wood from the canoe that was floating past him. Gist would manage to stay aboard the craft and steer it towards a small island. From here, he would fish the soaking Washington out of the water, and the two would promptly find themselves trapped there until daybreak would afford them enough visibility to continue on. They would both shiver all through the night. But Washington's remarkable constitution was on display, as he would survive relatively unscathed. Gist would be the one to suffer frostbite, the icy plague slowly taking over his fingers and toes, even though Washington had been the one who had plunged into the wintry stream. At dawn, they were relieved to see that the river had frozen overnight, and they crossed the remainder of it with relative ease. On January 16, 1754, Washington arrived in Williamsburg to hand-deliver the sealed letter from the French commandant to Royal Governor Dinwiddie. At this meeting, Washington would outline much of the details he had observed and recorded in his journals about the French fortifications and capabilities. Dinwiddie asked Washington to compile his notes into a concise report which he could deliver to the council the next day. Washington spent the night arranging the report, and its impact would be far greater than the young major could have expected. The report was published across the colonies as far north as Massachusetts, and it would be printed as a pamphlet in London entitled The Journal of Major George Washington. This thrust his name into the spotlight for the first time. For this expedition, Washington was paid £50, a figure that he found unfavorable, but he managed to parlay the event into a promotion to the rank of lieutenant colonel just around the time of his 22nd birthday. Dinwiddie ordered the construction of a fort at the forks of the Ohio, the location that had been suggested to him by Washington, and he brought on William Trent of the Ohio Company as a captain, with instructions to commence building the fort at once. Washington was ordered to cobble together what forces he could and to march them to the forks of the Ohio that spring to secure the area for the fort's construction. That February also saw 800 French-Canadian militia troops depart from Montreal, heading to the Ohio Valley. Washington's forces were paltry in comparison, a truly ragtag bunch, numbering just 160 at the time of departure. The Virginian wrote of his men that they were, quote, loose, idle persons that are quite destitute of house and home, and quite many of them clothes. Washington sought red uniforms for his men, of the kind worn by His Majesty's troops. He felt as though the colonial regiments were looked upon as second-class citizens, a feeling that would linger throughout his British colonial military career. When word came to Dinwiddie of a French raiding party charting a path towards the forks of the Ohio, Washington was ordered to take what troops he had and to head out at once. He was instructed to maintain a defensive posture, but was authorized to use deadly force were the French to obstruct any of their settlements or their fortifications. On April 2nd, Washington headed out with his green recruits. 3 weeks of traveling had passed when Washington received unsettling intelligence about French activity in the Ohio country. Over 1,000 French troops had overtaken British forces at the forks of the Ohio River, and the fort had fallen into French hands, being renamed Fort Duquesne. On the night of May 24th, Washington received word from his scouts that a French platoon had crossed the river and was staying just 18 miles away. Washington took up a defensive position at the Great Meadows near present-day Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Christopher Gist reported to Washington that French soldiers had invaded his cabin and threatened to kill his livestock and pillage his home. The Half-King, having rejoined forces with Washington once more, confirmed the existence of this rogue band of French Canadians and informed him that they had set up camp just 7 miles from their present location. Upon hearing this, Washington altered course from his defensive mindset, not wanting to toil through another night waiting to be stumbled upon or, worse yet, ambushed. Washington and the Half-King set out with 40 men, a dozen of which were natives, and voyaged into a rainy, moonless night, hunting for the French encampment. The night was so dark that the men continuously stumbled into one another as they marched single file. 7 soldiers actually went astray in the woods, losing step with those in front of them. But they were unwilling to cry out for help, as a break in the silence would give away their positions to any enemies who might be nearby. In the pre-dawn hours of May 28th, under the navigation of the Half-King, Washington leads the men to the crest of a hollow surrounded by rocks. From the high ground above the sleeping French camp, the natives slipped through the trees to encircle them and to block any escape from Washington and his men. Upon hearing the rustling around them, the French grasp for their arms and shots ring out towards the colonials. Washington's men fire 2 quick volleys that leave at least 10 French soldiers lying dead, while the rest throw down their arms and surrender. Now, as they descend upon the forfeiting side to capture their remaining men, this course of events takes a dark turn. From the woods behind the encampment, the Half-King walks towards the wounded French officer Joseph Coulon de Jumonville and speaks in French. "Thou art not yet dead, my father." The Half-King then raises the hatchet above his head and, with tremendous force, strikes it down upon the skull of Jumonville. He repeats this process 3 more times as a stunned Washington looks on. The Half-King now reaches his hand into the cracked skull of Jumonville, then ritualistically kneads his fingers as though he were washing his hands in it. Washington, having suffered 1 man killed and 3 others wounded, finds himself in a precarious circumstance. He knows that admonishing the Half-King could create an unwanted divide between them, and he seeks the most diplomatic way to make his position a sympathetic one. In his reporting of the events to Governor Dinwiddie, Washington emphasizes the French's aggression in the prelude to the fight, as well as the clandestine way they had spied on their party's activity, whereas Washington had delivered his diplomatic message the prior December with a statesmanlike dignity. The French account is markedly different from that of the British, and will even be used to propagandize Washington as a murderer and inflame the diplomatic relations of the 2 empires in precursor to war. Washington, however, does not have the time to ruminate on the empirical effects of his actions, as he knows a French counterattack will soon be on its way. The Virginian commands his men to dig a circular fortification for the coming onslaught, a fort that will come to be known as Fort Necessity, and the battle that follows will see the young lieutenant colonel captured by his newfound enemies. But the tales of heroism and sacrifice in the years and decades to come are too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Boonesboro, Kentucky, September 13, 1778. In the dim light of dawn, legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone crouches behind the wooden walls of the frontier fort and listens closely for any sign of movement coming from outside. Somewhere out there, in the dark, mist-covered forests, he knows that hundreds of Shawnee warriors are lying in wait. Boone and the 50 men around him with their rifles at the ready know an attack is coming, but they do not know when. Then, suddenly, the tree line explodes in a fireball. At the same instant, bullets slam into the timbered walls of the fort, sending splinters flying into the faces of several men. Seconds later, war cries abound from the forest, and another volley slams into the fort walls, this time from the trees to the south of them, and then another from the west. The Shawnee have returned, and it seems that they are everywhere, attacking from 3 sides at once. Boone and his companions now fire their rifles, unleashing a volley of their own into the Shawnee. The fight is now on, and for Boone and the other men inside the fort, the stakes are clear. It is victory or death. Because this is not a random attack by the Shawnee. Boone personally knows many of the warriors now swarming around the walls of the fort. Only months earlier, the Shawnee had considered him to be one of their own. In fact, their leader, a Shawnee chief named Blackfish, had considered Boone to be his adopted son. Now, they seek to kill him. Adding to Boone's troubles, many of his countrymen now fighting beside him have suspected for weeks that he may in fact be a spy for the Shawnee. Daniel Boone is a man caught in a very complex situation, but only he knows the truth of how he came to be here. It had only been last winter when he had led 30 men to the Blue Licks, a saline spring that runs off the Licks River in northern Kentucky, so that they could gather and then boil down the salty water. This would produce the salt they would need to cure their meat. A veteran of the frontier, Boone was well aware of the lurking dangers, from flooding rivers, to snakes, to bears and panthers, to hostile native tribes. But Boone and the other men had seen fit to make the treacherous journey for 3 reasons. 1. The intermittent fighting between themselves and the Shawnee had largely halted, as it often did during the winter. 2. Salt was an absolute necessity, and procuring it was very nearly a life-and-death matter for anyone living on the frontier. And 3. Boone and his American cohorts believed it to be land that they had rightfully purchased 3 years prior. And, in point of fact, they had, when Richard Henderson had purchased a tract of roughly 200,000 acres on the Ohio River with the signing of the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals in March of 1775. But there was a significant problem with Henderson's land deal. He had purchased the land from the Cherokee tribe, and, unfortunately for Henderson, the Cherokee had little to no jurisdiction in this area. This area, in fact, rightfully belonged to the Shawnee, and they viewed any American settlers as intruders on their land, deserving of death. This sentiment drove the Shawnee to an unlikely partnership, one that spawned from the unfolding American Revolution taking place several hundred miles to the east. British agents from Fort Detroit had struck deals with the Shawnee, agreeing to arm them in order to stop any westward expansion by American settlers. The British had signed a package deal of sorts, uniting the Shawnee with the Wyandot, the Mingo, and the Delaware tribes in order to wage an unremitting war against any and all American intruders. With their newfound support and newly gotten rifles, the Shawnee intended to reclaim their rightful lands once and for all. Before Boone and his men had even reached the Blue Licks area, Shawnee scouts were already closely following them. When the Americans had finally reached the salty waters, Boone had decided to venture out hunting in search of fresh meat. He had traveled only a few miles away from camp when he found himself suddenly surrounded by roughly 100 Shawnee warriors under the command of Chief Blackfish. The Shawnee were well aware of who Daniel Boone was. as his legend on the frontier had spread even to the native tribes. Boone was able to skillfully leverage his reputation and negotiate not only for his life, but the lives of his men. He managed to convince the Shawnee that he and his men were worth more to them as prisoners than as slain enemies. Chief Blackfish had spared Boone's life, but he demanded that Boone return to the Shawnee's camp and that he order his men to lay down their arms and surrender themselves to the Shawnee. The chief had insisted that if his demands were complied with, Boone and his comrades would remain unharmed. And to be sure, he had honored his word, as every member of the captured party was in fact treated humanely, at least by frontier standards. Still, the 28 captured men were forced to march roughly 160 miles to a large Shawnee village known as Chillicothe, located across the Ohio River. Throughout the lengthy march, Boone had impressed the Shawnee and his fellow captors with his endurance and stoicism. Boone's steadfastness and courage had so impressed the Shawnee that when they arrived at the village, he and his men were soon treated as adopted members of the tribe. Over the following few months, all of them would be treated humanely, a far preferable option to the torture killings that were often wrought upon captured men. Within months, most of the Kentuckians would be traded to other tribes or to the British to use as hostages in bargaining with the Americans. But Boone had so impressed Chief Blackfish that the old war chief had adopted him as his own son, perhaps as a replacement for a son he had lost in battle. Boone was given the Shawnee name of Sheltowee, or Big Turtle. His head was shaved except for a small lock on top of his scalp, and he wore traditional Shawnee clothing, including buckskin breeches, a thin shirt, and leather moccasins. He learned the Shawnee language and took part in hunting and scouting parties, valued for his skills and bravery. Boone even joined a Shawnee delegation who traveled to British-held Fort Detroit, where British officer Henry Hamilton attempted to bargain for Boone's release. But the Shawnee had resolutely refused any offer, as they now regarded Boone as one of their own. Throughout this time, in the spring of 1778, Boone had found himself increasingly torn between two worlds. On one hand, he was indeed a Kentucky settler, with a wife and children waiting for him back at the Boonesboro fort, all of whom were no doubt grieving his absence and constantly worried about his safety. On the other hand, he now found himself identifying more with the Shawnee people and with Chief Blackfish. The chief and his people had come to depend on Boone as well, as his skills as a tracker, hunter, and negotiator had made him an invaluable member of their village. They also possessed a true sense of love and fidelity for the frontiersman, one he felt more and more attached to. But soon, the pull of his loyalty to his family back in Boonesboro began to weigh more and more heavily on Boone. Then, one day during June of 1778, word reached Blackfish's village that the warriors from several Shawnee villages were amassing their forces for an all-out assault on Boonesboro. This was the final straw for Boone. Though he feigned loyalty to the Shawnee for a few weeks, he soon slipped away while out on a hunting party with other Shawnee. He made his way on foot back to Boonesboro, only to be met with bad news and an icy greeting. Boone's entire family, save for his beloved daughter Jemima, had left the settlement and retreated east to stay with family. Several of the men who he had been captured with had already made their way back to Boonesboro and reported that Boone was now living with the Shawnee. Reports from merchants and traders who had passed through the fort insisted that Boone was spotted in full Shawnee dress, even with his hair cut into their traditional style. This soon drew suspicions from a number of the settlers, and when Boone returned, many greeted him tacitly, leaving Boone confused and hurt. But Boone's loyalties were soon made clear when he warned his countrymen of the approaching Shawnee attack. This was not merely a raid for prisoners or supplies, he warned them. but an attempt at all-out annihilation. Within hours of his return, the fort was abuzz with men, women, and children working furiously to prepare the fort for the oncoming attack. As much water as could be carried was gathered from the nearby creek, one bucket at a time. Weapons were cleaned, doors reinforced, and ammunition stockpiled at strategic points along the wall. Boone's brother, Squire Boone, a noted local inventor, employed several ingenious measures to fortify the men's fighting positions. He cut angles into the insides of the firing ports, allowing the men inside to maneuver themselves with minimal exposure to enemy fire coming from outside. He designed a water supply system made of dugout logs which could supply the men at the walls with a continuous supply of water. He also designed a primitive frontier cannon made of hollowed-out logs strapped together with iron rings. These arduous preparations continue for months, and as Boone and the others worked, they all knew that somewhere, out in the dark, foreboding forest, the Shawnee were making preparations of their own, and soon they would make their attack. Finally, on September 7th, at around midday, a party of Shawnee, roughly 400 to 600 strong, arrived at the fort. They were led by Chief Blackfish and flying a British flag. For 2 months now, everyone inside the fort had worried about this day, dreading the sight of belligerent warriors crashing through the tree line, barreling towards them with hellish war cries. And perhaps none among them had worried so much as Daniel Boone. But Blackfish, his adopted father, had appeared with an agreeable look on his face and beckoned to them with overtures of peace. Many inside the fort felt a rush of relief, but Boone and the other more experienced frontiersmen remained dubious. Still, they had little choice but to at least try to negotiate for a peaceable outcome. Boone and 8 to 9 other men soon ventured out of the gates and met Chief Blackfish and his men in a small clearing just outside the fort. The meeting with his former friends and adopted father at first had been peaceable, but before long, after a signal from Blackfish, the warriors had attempted to seize Boone and his comrades in order to hold them hostage. But Boone and the others had managed to slip free and flee back into the relative safety of the fort. This had marked the beginning of 5 long days of what amounted to a siege, with the Shawnees surrounding the fort and Boone and the Kentuckians trapped inside. On the second day of the siege, continuous sniper fire between the two parties was exchanged. On the third day, the Shawnee had attempted to set fire to the fort, but Squire Boone's water supply system, along with bucket lines of women and children, along with intermittent rains, had managed to quell the flames. On day 4, the Shawnee had begun digging a tunnel from the riverbank to the fort in hopes of digging under the fort's walls, lighting a fire, and causing the walls to eventually collapse. On the 5th day, firing on both sides continued, resulting in a Shawnee being killed near the tunnel entrance, lowering their morale and causing them to abandon the tunnel. On day 7, the Shawnee have again massed their forces to attack the fort, but this time, Chief Blackfish has ordered a coordinated attack, and as Boone and the men inside the fort now continuously fire and reload, they must defend 3 sides of the fort all at once, while outnumbered roughly 20 to 1. The fighting continues like this for a number of hours until mid-morning, when the Shawnee unleash the next phase of their attack. Now, warriors begin rolling bundles of burning brush up against the palisade walls and throwing torches into the fort. A section of the palisade walls does indeed catch fire, but it is quickly put out due to the skillful work of Squire Boone. But now, the battlefield outside the walls is covered in a thick cloud of smoke. This obscures the Shawnees' movements, and dozens of warriors are able to move into position only a few yards away from the fort's walls. Now, they hammer the compound with bullets and arrows, attempting to shoot between the thin slits between the logs that make up the walls of the fort. The Kentuckians are left to aim at mere shadows and flashes, all obscured by the heavy smoke. For hour after hour, this vicious exchange continues, with the women and children of the fort being employed to melt and pour lead for ammunition and to assist in reloading the weapons, while the men focus on firing upon the Shawnee. For his part, Chief Blackfish is able to rotate new warriors in every few hours, allowing his men to get at least some measure of rest during the fighting. But for Daniel Boone and the other settlers inside the fort, there is no such luxury. Just before noon, a number of warriors are nearly able to breach the southern wall, leaving Daniel Boone, Squire Boone, and others firing at point-blank range, only narrowly avoiding being overrun when the Shawnee at the wall finally fall back after 30 minutes of close combat, leaving several of their comrades dead on the ground. But the Shawnee attack has only begun. Throughout the afternoon, the firing continues, with wave after wave of Shawnee pouring fire into the fort, and the defenders becoming more and more exhausted. Many within Boonesboro can now barely breathe, as thick layers of smoke seem to settle within the walls, causing many to choke and to cough. But still, the battle carries on, with the Shawnee seeming more resolved than ever to destroy the Kentuckians once and for all. Through it all, Daniel Boone maintains an air of calm and confidence, encouraging the men and assuring the women and children. If nothing else, any lingering questions of Boone's loyalty have now been put to rest. Finally, just as the sun begins to set, Chief Blackfish orders one final, massive charge targeting the weakened southern wall. Again, hordes of Shawnee warriors pour out of the woods, and again, they throw bundles of burning brush and torches against the fort's walls. More volleys of bullets and arrows pour into the fort, and the defenders again man their stations at the portholes and resume firing. This time, though, they are finally able to inflict enough losses to seemingly break the Shawnees' morale. The warriors soon mount a retreat, melting into the tree line and disappearing from sight. The fields that separate the fort from the trees are now strewn with torches, weapons, trampled crops, dead livestock, and the bodies of more than 36 Shawnee warriors. Many inside the fort feel that the fight has finally been won, but Daniel Boone knows better. He orders double sentries posted on each wall, and for the rest of his men, most of whom have been fighting for almost 36 straight hours, to get some rest. The Shawnee, he assures them, will return. And the next day, Boone is proven correct, as Chief Blackfish, having abandoned the notion of a head-on assault, has ordered his warriors to resume tunneling underneath the fort. This time, though, the settlers dig their own counter-tunnel, flooding the path of the Shawnees' tunnel and thwarting their hopes of any subterranean assault. The day after this, on September 15th, the 9th day of the siege, the Shawnee actually resume their tactics of making a charge upon the weakened southern wall of the fort. Close quarters fighting again ensues, but again, the Shawnee are rebuffed. However, despite another small victory, exhaustion is beginning to take hold over all of those inside the fort. Finally, on the day after this, the 10th day of the siege, it seems that Shawnee activity has almost halted. Scouts sent into the woods return to report that the Shawnee have begun to move their wounded north of the Ohio River. It seems that Blackfish has concluded that he will need artillery in order to properly assault Boonesboro, and that he can take no more casualties at this point. Finally, after a restless, unsure night, Boone allows the gates of the fort to be opened. The Shawnee are gone. For now. The final estimates hold that 37 Shawnee have perished, along with 2 of the settlers. But under Daniel Boone's leadership, the Kentuckians have managed to survive the impossible. After the battle, the Shawnee and Chief Blackfish would find themselves momentarily disoriented. However, Blackfish would soon resume his attacks on the Americans, determined to drive back their incursion at any cost. In 1779, the year after the Siege of Boonesborough, he would perish in an assault on Fort Randolph, a loss his people would never truly recover from. But even after the loss of Blackfish, the fight between the Shawnee and the Kentuckians is not over. Daniel Boone as well would continue to face a number of challenges in the coming year, even being court-martialed by the Virginia militia in 1778 under charges that he had surrendered his party at the Blue Licks too easily, and that he had conspired with the Shawnee. Boone, however, resolutely defended himself against these charges and was quickly acquitted of all of them. But Daniel Boone's war with the Shawnee had only just begun. The coming years will see countless engagements with the tribe, as well as a number of devastating personal losses that will change the course of his life forever. But the many tales of the legendary frontier war between Daniel Boone and the Shawnee are, for tonight, other stories for other times. San Antonio, Texas, March 6, 1836. As dawn breaks and the sound of cannon fire and gunshots fill the air, Davy, Crockett, and a contingent of defenders on the southwestern corner of the Alamo shoulder their rifles and unleash volley after volley into Mexican Army soldiers as they hurry to scramble up the steep wooden ladders that they have propped up against the mission walls. As Crockett reloads, men begin to fall to his left and to his right, and looking down from the top of the wall, he can see the hordes of Mexican soldiers scrambling to overtake this small mission. He and his men are vastly outnumbered, and they know that they are, in no uncertain terms, in a fight to the death. As the soldiers swarm up the ladders, cannonball after cannonball crashes into the thick adobe walls of the mission, rapidly bludgeoning a larger and larger hole for the attacking troops. Crockett, along with every one of his comrades who have spent the last few weeks defending this small former Spanish mission, has hardly slept. Many had labored into the night, fortifying weak points in their defenses by piling up stones and soil. Most have also spent the previous few hours restlessly turning under their blankets, hoping to find some rest before the coming battle. Most, however, had found little. And now, the fight is here. Soon, the shrieks of the wounded on both sides join the chorus of the horrific din of battle. Crockett now shoulders his rifle again and fires again, as do his comrades. But there is no time to mask their fire, and each man now simply does his best to fire and reload as quickly as possible. Soon, the first line of attackers begin to pour over the walls, being met by Crockett and his men, who now unleash a ferocious close-quarters attack with knives, pistols, and anything else that they can find. But the Mexican troops are themselves resigned to a vicious fight, and they wage a ferocious counterattack as what amounts to a life-or-death street fight takes place just inside the wall's parapet. Most of the men here are American citizens, who have moved to Texas in search of a better life and who have decided to fight for Texas's right to secede from Mexico. However, contrary to popular belief, many of the defenders are, in fact, not Americans, but immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Denmark, as well as a number of native-born Mexicans who have sided with the Texian cause, who are known as Tejanos. But no man at the Alamo, be they American, Tejano, or Dutchman, is as well known as David "Davy" Crockett. Even at this point in 1836, Crockett is a national celebrity, known as both a legendary hunter and frontiersman, as well as a master storyteller and a sort of backwoods statesman. In the previous decade, he has met with presidents and foreign dignitaries, attended high society parties in New York and Washington, D.C., served in the halls of Congress, and even been the subject of a Broadway play. Now, it seems that his story will end here, in the hard, dusty ground of Texas. But, of course, this is not where his story began. Crockett's legend began in the hills of what was then considered the state of Franklin, what would eventually become the state of Tennessee, in Greene County in 1786. He was born to John and Rebecca Crockett, the fourth of 5 boys and the 7th of 9 children. He had grown up on the frontier, tracking, hunting, and fishing. He had also been turned out by his father as labor in order to pay off his father's debts. He had served in the War of 1812 under Andrew Jackson, working mostly as a scout and hunter, but gaining a reputation for his skill and endurance. He had married Polly Finley in 1806, with whom he had 3 children: John Wesley Crockett, born in 1807, William Finley Crockett, born in 1809, and Margaret Finley Crockett, born in 1814. Polly would pass away in 1815, likely from complications during childbirth or some related illness. Crockett would remarry quickly, as was common for widows and widowers alike, marrying Elizabeth Patton later in 1815. With Elizabeth, who herself had 3 children from a prior marriage, he would go on to have 3 more children: Robert, Rebecca, and Matilda Crockett. Soon after remarrying, Crockett would see the first advancements in his burgeoning political career, as a consequence of his ability to captivate an audience with his simplistic but enthralling storytelling style, regaling many eager listeners with tales of his wild life on the frontier. In 1817, he was elected Justice of the Peace of Lawrence County, then Lieutenant Colonel of the local militia, and finally as a state legislator to the Tennessee House in 1821. Throughout this time, Crockett, along with thousands of other Tennessee migrants, had moved his family further and further westward to the less populated areas of the territory. Here, on the fringes of the frontier, his popularity had grown amongst his constituents as a trustworthy, plain-spoken representative who could be counted on to act in their best interests. This reputation further spurred his political rise, seeing him elected to Congress in 1827. Here, he had famously broken ranks with his former commander, now President Andrew Jackson, vehemently opposing his Indian Removal Act of 1830. His opposition to the act had been so greatly appreciated by the Cherokee people that, in January of 1831, Cherokee Chief John Ross had sent Crockett a letter expressing his gratitude for the Tennesseans' steadfast support. But this stance had also been a driving force behind losing his bid for re-election, as opposing Jackson had cost him much support in his home state, largely populated by ardent Jackson supporters. In the 1831 election, he would lose to Jacksonian politician William Fitzgerald. This, however, would not end his political career, nor his celebrity. In 1831, The Lion of the West, a loosely biographical play starring the character Nimrod Wildfire as Crockett, had been a smash hit amongst New York audiences. Crockett had even attended a performance and been given a standing ovation after being pointed out to the audience. In 1833, he would regain his office, defeating Fitzgerald and returning to Congress, where he would serve until 1835. In 1835, however, he was again defeated in his bid for re-election by another Jacksonian politician named Adam Huntsman. Growing frustrated with the fickle nature of his constituency, Crockett, who had already been exchanging letters with friends in Texas, had finally, famously declared to his fellow Tennesseans that they may all go to hell. I am going to Texas. However, in 1835, Texas was a veritable tinderbox of political upheaval and an increasingly dangerous place for Anglo-American settlers seeking to stake their claim within the burgeoning republic. the Mexican government had, until now, actually permitted relatively unfettered settlement rights to Americans seeking to build homesteads in the areas that now comprise central Texas. This, in fact, was in large part seen as a preventative measure, one that provided a sort of human buffer between the larger settlements of northern Mexico and even Mexico City itself from attack by the actual reigning power of Texas, the Comanche. But the laissez-faire nature of Mexican immigration laws had seen a radical reform in 1830 with the law of April 6, 1830, that severely restricted further Anglo incursion into the area. Special taxes and tariffs were also levied on the citizens living in Texas, further stoking their collective sense of injustice. This sense of frustration was, in fact, nothing new to the Texas frontier, as citizens of Mexico who already inhabited the area, known as Tejanos, had borne the burden of ferocious native attacks for decades, only to be largely seen as secondary concerns by their representatives in Mexico City. At the beginning of the 1830s, their sense of shared indignity had been ratcheted up even further by Mexican General San Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's orders for Mexican troops to occupy towns in northern Mexico, including Anahuac, Velasco, and San Antonio, then known as Bejar. This had caused even more unrest amongst the local population and further solidified the shared interests and loyalties of the Anglo-Americans and Tejanos. However, one sizable point of contention between the two parties was the issue of slavery, which many of the Anglo settlers, especially those in the eastern reaches of Texas and those with roots in the Deep South, saw as an indispensable part of their culture. Though Mexico had officially abolished slavery in 1829, many of the settlers who already owned slaves failed to abide by the new policy. Many of the Tejanos were either reluctantly tolerant or tacitly disapproving of the abhorrent practice, which had never been a central aspect in their culture. Still, in the interest of gaining their independence from the Mexican government, which had failed them for so long, most of the Tejano population saw fit to overlook their disagreements. By October of 1835, tensions had erupted at the Battle of Gonzales, in which Mexican officials had demanded that the town of Gonzales surrender a pair of cannons that had been loaned to them for use in defense against the Comanche and other local tribes. The Texians, though, had refused, instead hiding the cannons until the morning of October 2nd, when they had filled them with scrap metal and met the Mexican army on the banks of the Guadalupe River under a flag that read, "Come and take it." They fired upon the Mexican soldiers, and after a brief skirmish, the Mexicans retreated, yielding the Texians an unlikely and morale-boosting victory. This skirmish effectively marked the beginning of the Texas Revolution. A week later, on October 9th, the Texans had moved to seize the Presidio La Bahia at Goliad in order to cut off the Mexican army's supplies to San Antonio. Attacking under cover of night, they had managed to seize control of the Presidio with one Texian wounded and one Mexican soldier killed. This gave the rebel Texans control over a vital strategic point and further boosted their confidence and enthusiasm, perhaps to the point of hubris. On October 28th, they had again won a decisive victory at the Battle of La Concepcion, and again in December at the Siege of Bejar, in which they had wrested control of San Antonio from Santa Anna's army and took over the city for themselves. By this point, the vast majority of Texans sensed that the victory they sought was well within reach, if not already outright assured. They took control of the old mission, known as the Alamo, and began to fortify it for use as a defensive position when Santa Anna inevitably returned with his army for one last effort to hold on to the crucially important city. For many among the roughly 200 Texans now firmly in control of San Antonio, this was an opportunity that they looked forward to, as they believed that they would not only defeat the much-hated general, but force him to surrender. By the time Davy Crockett and a band of his close friends had begun to make their way to Texas, all among them believed that they were on their way to be part of a great victory. Their main concern was simply that they might miss out on the fighting. By the time Crockett and company arrived at the Alamo, command of the Texian forces had changed hands a number of times. Original Commander Edward Burleson, who would go on to carve his own legendary reputation in Texas history, had resigned, and Francis Johnson had taken his place. Johnson had proven to be unpopular and lost confidence amongst his men after an ill-advised expeditionary trip into Mexico had left the men in San Antonio hard-pressed for ammunition and supplies for a number of weeks. James Clinton Neal had replaced Johnson in January of 1836, but had been forced to resign his position and return home after receiving word that members of his family had become critically ill. In his stead, joint command of the city and of the Alamo had fallen to two men. One was a 26-year-old Alabama lawyer who had fled severe debt in his homeland, leaving his wife and two young children, and moved to Mexican-held Texas. He had quickly become politically involved, gaining local renown as a firebrand revolutionary and immovable supporter of Texas's independence. His name was Colonel William B. Travis. The other was a 42-year-old frontiersman, entrepreneur, and real estate speculator of questionable repute. He was, in fact, a celebrity himself, though of a more regional nature than Crockett. He had gained his renown after a knife fight on a small island on the Mississippi River in 1827, in which he had used a massive knife given to him by his brother to eviscerate his opponent in a brawl over a duel. Though he had been wounded several times himself, his name had both risen to that of a frontier legend and given birth to one of the Old West's most famous weapons. In the preceding months, he had also, tragically, become stricken with a deadly illness, most likely typhoid pneumonia. Despite all of his repute, it was evident to himself and to all who saw him that he was a man quickly succumbing to his ailments. His name was Jim Bowie. When Davy Crockett and his contingent of roughly 30 volunteers arrived at the Alamo on February 8th of 1836, he was met and warmly welcomed by Bowie and Travis. It had seemed to all three of the men that victory for Texas was surely at hand. But over the following 2 weeks, the situation had rapidly deteriorated. Even as Crockett had been making his way south to Texas, General Santa Anna, fuming at having been forced to cede control of San Antonio to the Texians, was already on a march north from Mexico City with thousands of troops. A polarizing figure in his home country, Santa Anna believes that his tenuous hold on his power in Mexico cannot withstand the shame of a defeat against the ragtag militias of Texas. With this in mind, he had pushed his army to return to San Antonio as quickly as possible in order to retake the city and beat the Texians into submission. On February 23rd, only 2 weeks after Crockett's arrival, sentries inside the Alamo had spotted Mexican cavalry in the hills near San Antonio. This stunned the Texians within the city, as none could believe that Santa Anna and his troops had been able to make their return so quickly. Now, roughly 1,500 to 1,800 Mexican troops surrounded their force of roughly 180 men. For Crockett, Bowie, Travis, and the rest of the defenders at the Alamo, it had been made immediately clear that the fight had been brought to their doorstep, and that they would have to make their stand much sooner than they had anticipated. Travis and Bowie had ordered every Texan in San Antonio to immediately make their way to the Alamo, their only refuge within the entire city. The rebels had been caught off guard, and Santa Anna knew it. the Mexican army had quickly taken control of the city and surrounded the Alamo, trapping the defenders within its walls. For their parts, the Texians, several of them with their wives and children, were now cut off from escape and in dire need of reinforcements. For 13 torturous days, the Mexican army had laid siege to the Alamo, incessantly pounding the main adobe-walled building with artillery and destroying the wooden walls that encompassed the compound. Throughout the siege, Santa Anna had sent several envoys to negotiate for the Texians' surrender, but all had been soundly refused by the defenders. On February 24th, the second day of the siege, Colonel Travis had written a letter, sent out by way of Captain Albert Martin, who volunteered for the incredibly dangerous task of skulking out of the city at night and delivering the letter 75 miles east to his hometown of Gonzales, Texas. The letter, pleading for help from his leadership but resolved to fight to the end, read as follows: "I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna, and I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you, in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and of everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid. Victory or death." Though Captain Martin and 31 other intrepid men from Gonzales would actually make their way into the Alamo in an effort to provide reinforcements, their number was but a fraction of that Travis had hoped for. On the same day that Travis had sent his letter, General Santa Anna had ordered the black flag of no quarter raised above his headquarters, signaling to the Texians that none of them would be spared should they fail to surrender. While Travis may or may not have drawn a line in the sand with his sword and asked all of those willing to give their lives to step over the line in a symbol of their resolve, it was quite clear to Crockett and all of his fellow defenders that all of those who did not surrender to the Mexican army would pay with their lives. But save for Lewis Rose, the one man who chose to escape with his life, the men inside the Alamo all chose to remain and pay the ultimate price. Now, after laying siege to the Alamo compound for 2 weeks, Santa Anna has ordered the attack that is now flooding inside the walls of the former mission. Within minutes, Colonel Travis, defending the north side of the compound, is shot dead with a musket ball through the forehead. Meanwhile, Jim Bowie lies inside a small room, bedridden and so stricken by his illness that the famous frontier fighter is unable to even stand, much less present any kind of resistance. As the battle rages outside, Mexican soldiers barge into the room where Bowie lies and quickly put an end to his storied life with their bayonets. Meanwhile, Crockett, one of the few remaining combatants towards the latter stages of the fight, continues to pour fire into the attacking soldiers until he is run entirely out of ammunition. At this point, he and his fellow defenders use their rifles as clubs and slash and stab with their large hunting knives, using anything at their disposal to fight to the bitter end, as all among them know that these are their last moments. Crockett, as well, will meet his end on this bloody morning. However, it is not entirely clear exactly how he was killed. Some accounts hold that Crockett was shot and killed in the latter stages of the battle, while others say he and a small number of defenders who were left alive were actually taken prisoner and summarily executed under the watchful eye of General Santa Anna. While his exact cause of death is unknown, the ultimate fate of the Alamo defenders will be the same for all of them. The bodies of the dead men, who had only hours earlier stirred inside the compound walls, are laboriously stacked into piles by the Mexican troops and then lit on fire, denying them all both funerals and proper graves. But while the Battle of the Alamo had ended in a resounding defeat for the Texians, their resolve and willingness to give their all would soon give birth to a renewed fury amongst their countrymen. While General Santa Anna had expected that his victory would result in breaking the will of the Texians, he would soon be horrified when it in fact produced the opposite result. Instead of inducing surrender, the example of the Alamo defenders would soon renew the fury of the rebels, resulting in several key defeats for the Mexican army, all while cries of "Remember the Alamo" resounded about the battlefield. With his ultimate defeat at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, Santa Anna would be forced into surrender, and Texas would gain its ultimate independence from Mexico. But without the sacrifice of the men at the Alamo, this victory may very well have never have occurred. Though certainly imperfect men, the names of Bowie, Travis, and, perhaps more than any, Davy Crockett will forever be remembered as examples of full devotion to a cause, even at the cost of one's own life. In modernity, Crockett has gone on to become known in American culture as a sort of pop culture figure, one who was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee and killed himself a bar when he was only 3. But the truth behind the man is, arguably, far more unbelievable and far more consequential than even contemporary lore has given him credit for. But the many stories of the frontier exploits of Davy Crockett, from the hunting of the Tennessee woods to his service in the Creek War, as well as the countless other instances that have been overlooked by mainstream history outlets, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Seattle, Washington, January 26, 1856. As a cold morning wind rolls in from the Pacific, a group of Nisqually warriors lie quiet in the shadowy woods surrounding the cabin of local settler Tom Pepper. They are waiting for the perfect moment to unleash their ambush on first this cabin and then the whole of the burgeoning settlement of Seattle. Several groups of their fellow warriors now lie in wait at various points around the town, waiting for their moment to strike. But just as the first rays of sunlight appear through the trees, a thunderous boom is heard coming from the bay. Then, seconds later, a few hundred yards away, the hillside seemingly explodes out of nowhere, sending chunks of soil and timber in all directions and shaking the very ground beneath them. It is an artillery shell, fired from the deck of the USS Decatur, a naval vessel harbored in the cold waters of Puget Sound. Now, chaos breaks out amongst the warriors. Their plan of attack has been compromised, but the battle has just begun, and now there is no turning back. However, with time now being of the essence, the attack on Pepper's cabin is abandoned. The main target of their attack now turns to one of the fortified American blockhouses that surround the city. The blockhouses contain a number of local militia, as well as U.S. Navy sailors and U.S. Marines charged with protecting the small settlement. Several of these defensive positions have been set in place by the captain of the Decatur, Gwert Gansevoort. The navigator of the Decatur, T.S. Phelps, has spent the weeks prior to this attempting to better organize the local militia, but has been met with a staunch lack of motivation and discipline on their behalf. The sailors and Marines under his charge had acquitted themselves well in their duties, but many of the local militia had frustrated him with their lack of basic skills and their shared sentiment that Seattle was in no real danger of attack. In fact, many citizens of Seattle thought that an all-out attack from the native tribes surrounding the area was all but impossible. Now, with the attack underway, the settlement rapidly devolves into chaos. The men within the blockhouses are roused and ordered to their positions. Some of the men, primarily the Marines and sailors, begin to fire their weapons into the oncoming native warriors. But many of the militia prove to be combat ineffective, at least initially, as they intermittently abandon their positions or simply hide behind the wooden breastworks, too unnerved by the attack to mount any kind of defense. The native forces, composed of warriors from several tribes including the Nisqually, the Klickitat, the Spokane, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, the Yakima, and the Paleute tribe, have coalesced to resist the continued encroachment of their lands. The tensions between the Americans and the native tribes had risen to a fever pitch the year prior to this, in 1855. After the United States formally recognized the Washington Territories in 1853, treaties had been struck between the U.S. government and many of the tribes surrounding the area. However, as was often the case, these agreements were often broached by the United States as expansion and settlement of the areas beyond the agreed-upon bounds continued. The Nisqually tribe, who had inhabited the inland forest and mountains for thousands of years, had initially had peaceful interactions with the government and settlers. But the 1854 Treaty of Medicine Creek had caused a sizable rift between themselves and the U.S. government when the tribe agreed to cede some of their lands, but ended up losing their prime farming territory. Among the most vocal critics of the treaty was a Nisqually chief named Leschi, who argued that the treaty was unscrupulous and unfair. He had rallied several of his fellow tribesmen to march to Olympia, demanding to see the governor, a man by the name of Colonel Isaac Stevens. But Stevens, in staunch opposition to his cause, refused to even meet with him. Seeing the treatment of their chief at the hands of the governor, many of the Nisqually had seen no other recourse but military action. Chief Leschi himself had opposed attacking the city of Seattle, but his words had fallen on deaf ears. In the weeks prior to this attack, a band of Nisqually warriors had wrought havoc on a series of settlements on nearby White Creek. Several Americans had been killed, and tensions had continued to rise. However, Governor Stevens had still dismissed any notion that there might be a large-scale attack on Seattle itself. The governor had then departed the settlement, secure in his assessment that any further violence would be limited and inconsequential. However, almost immediately following his departure, several of Seattle's native inhabitants, many of whom had developed close relationships with many of the settlers, had fervently warned their American friends that an attack was all but imminent. One Seattle resident, a local doctor named David Swinson Maynard, went so far as to evacuate 434 native residents to the west side of the bay so as to protect them from a large-scale attack on the east side of the bay. But still, many other Seattle residents agreed with Governor Stevens' assessment of the situation and continued to deny any possibility of danger. Many of the volunteer local militia had even argued in the preceding weeks that an organized defense force was needless, as the naval ship Decatur was now anchored in the bay and would provide more than enough defense against any attacking force. Now, as the native warriors flood past the defensive positions of the Marines and the militiamen, it seems to many of the residents that their hubris might now cost them their lives. As gunshots ring out up and down First Street, 52 women and children are evacuated to the Decatur, taking refuge aboard the ship while the fight unfolds. Most of the remaining native inhabitants also take to their canoes, taking to the water and visibly separating themselves from the attacking native forces in order to avoid any confusion and friendly fire. Meanwhile, the 3rd Division of Marines now decide that they must mount a head-on charge in order to drive back the oncoming warriors now pouring down the main trail into town. Seeing the dire nature of their situation, this division disobeys their orders to hold their position and charges upon one faction of the attacking warriors. The charge itself is a disorganized, haphazard affair, as the Marines charge up a steep hill to cut off the native warriors. However chaotic, though, the tactic does in fact work, repelling the oncoming warriors to the northeast and buying the other defenders precious time in order to fortify their positions inside the city limits. Tragically, though, as the Americans had begun their charge from the outskirts of Seattle, an errant shot from one of the native warriors resulted in a young boy named Milton G. Holgate being struck and killed. Meanwhile, south of town, a prolonged but intermittent gunfight takes place between a group of Seattle citizens and a group of native warriors, the parties being separated by a large expanse of boggy territory. The fight here continues for several hours, seeing several native warriors either killed or wounded, but only one Seattle resident, a man by the name of Christian White, a relative newcomer to town, being killed when he stuck his head out from behind the log he was using as cover in order to get a drink from the nearby stream. Now, both warriors and Seattle residents settle into stalemates at every position surrounding the town, with the fight grinding on through the afternoon. Though the warriors fight valiantly, their morale soon begins to wane. Not only have they taken on more casualties than they had anticipated, but the incessant cannon fire being poured into their positions from the Decatur is making an all-out takeover of the town seem less and less probable. This adds to the demoralization of the warrior coalition, as many young men among them anticipated a great victory against the settlers, one that would drive their enemy from their territory for good. But many things have already gone wrong. First, the timing of the attack itself seems to have been a costly mistake. The initial plan had been to attack during the nighttime. Had they done this, they would likely have caught the men in the blockhouses completely off guard before the Decatur had a chance to pour in its cannon deflates. The time for this attack had, in fact, been carefully planned, and the warriors had reconnoitered the habits and routines of the military forces surrounding Seattle. They had discerned that the enlistments of the militia volunteers often expired on the 21st of the month, and thus an attack later in the month would mean striking the town when it was at its weakest. They had also watched closely as the Decatur had limped into the Puget Sound the week prior, having been badly damaged on a reef as she had made her way south along the Pacific coastline. The ship had been so badly damaged that it had to be beached for repairs. Seeing the compromised state of Seattle's defenses, many among the warriors had felt that a resounding victory had been all but assured. Now, as they hunker down behind the trees and stumps and fallen logs to avoid the gunfire coming from the settlers and the incessant fire from the Decatur, their hopes seem dashed. By early evening, as the sun begins to sink into the western horizon, the native forces begin to withdraw. Though the exact numbers of their losses are unknown, it is estimated that roughly 28 are killed. Comparatively, the Americans have suffered a total of 3 fatalities: the young Milton Holgate, the unfortunate Christian White, and another Navy sailor, a deserter from the Decatur who was mistakenly shot by a frightened settler as he attempted to barge into the settler's cabin in search of shelter from the battle. Despite the cessation of the battle, though, as the moon rises over Seattle, its residents remain in a state of vigilance and unease. They do not know whether the warriors have retreated for good or if they are merely regrouping somewhere in the dark woods. But the next day sees no attack, and it seems that the Battle of Seattle is over. But now, a fresh wave of paranoia sweeps the residents, as does a growing resentment for Governor Stevens for leaving them so vulnerable to the attack. At around noon the next day, another naval vessel, the USS Active, sails into the Puget Sound, carrying Governor Stevens. He appears before the residents, seemingly contrite and chagrined, and promises that he will order their city to be immediately fortified against another such attack. With his political and personal failure weighing heavily on both himself and his reputation, Stevens reboards the USS Active and heads back to the capital of Olympia in order to raise the alarm and make good on his promises. Several days after the attack, Nisqually Chief Leschi and a number of his fellow warriors appear at the ranch of local settler John McLeod and his Nisqually wife. They insist that they were not involved in the attack on Seattle. They plead for the pair to argue their case to the governor, insisting that they were in fact not part of the attack on the city and thus should not be punished by any retributions meted out by the government. But in 1857, Leschi would be arrested for the supposed murder of a local militiaman during the Puget Sound War.
Though he had indeed been involved in the fighting during the war, the consensus amongst both his fellow Nisqually and even the Americans themselves, soldiers and settlers alike, is that Leschi is indeed innocent of these charges. In fact, his first trial had resulted in a hung jury. Then, a retrial was ordered, and Governor Stevens, hungry to make an example of Leschi in hopes of dissuading any further attacks, had heavily pressured legal officials for a conviction. The second trial would indeed result in a guilty verdict, and Leschi was sentenced to be executed by hanging at Fort Steilacoom. This sentence was seen as such a judicial travesty that the local sheriff, Tom Granger, submitted to arrest rather than carry out the hanging. Officers at the fort also protested, arguing that the only killing Leschi had done had been in battle, which was not a crime necessitating capital punishment. They viewed him as a fellow warrior, and though an enemy combatant, still worthy of respect. Many protests from the Nisqually and other native tribes, as well as settlers throughout the area, poured into Governor Stevens' office, but fell on deaf ears. Thus, on February 19, 1858, Chief Leschi, a baptized Catholic since his youth, walked to the gallows at the fort, accompanied by the fort's Catholic priest, Father Pascal Ricard. Eyewitness accounts describe Leschi as dignified and courageous in his last moments, but all remark on the great travesty of justice he suffered before meeting his death at the end of the hangman's noose. This incident was seen as judicial murder, plain and simple, and forever damaged relations between the Americans and the native tribes. It also did irreparable damage to the reputation of Governor Stevens. In the coming years, the Puget Sound War would come to an end, and Seattle would continue to expand. And the Nisqually and their neighbors would see their territories continue to contract in the face of encroaching settlement. The Nisqually would find themselves confined to the Medicine Creek Reservation, where they would continue to see their lands shrink until many of them were displaced again by the United States in 1917 during World War I. Stevens himself would be called back into duty with the Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. Appointed as colonel of the 79th New York Volunteers, he would later be promoted to brigadier general. On September 1, 1862, he would be killed in the Battle of Chantilly, after attempting to carry the regimental colors when his color-bearer was wounded in the initial charge against the Confederate forces. He would be laid to rest in Rhode Island in 1862, only 4 years after Chief Leschi's execution. Though the Battle of Seattle resulted in relatively few deaths and casualties, the ripple effect of the attack resounded through the Pacific Northwest for decades. In the decades that followed, Seattle would grow from a small settlement to a sizable port city, and eventually to its current iteration as a modern metropolitan hub for technology, medicine, education, and industry. Most of Seattle's current 800,000-plus residents, along with over 4 million residents in the greater Seattle area, have likely never heard of the 1856 life-and-death fight between native warriors and early Seattle residents. But this battle played a pivotal role in not only the history of their city, but in the history of the native tribes of their area and the United States as well. But the many stories of the Puget Sound War, as well as the proud native peoples of the Pacific Northwest and the intrepid settlers of the American West, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. Also, be sure to follow us on TikTok and Instagram, and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.